So we're here at the Wellness Center inside, and we're assembling the frame for stretching the hide on, and we are just trying to make a rectangle, and we'll lace up the hide around it. One of the things that we've done is on the bottom part is left about an inch to allow the rope to be able to go through, because otherwise you have to lift up the frame each time you pull the rope through. So the wood is just 2x material, so they're like 2x6s. The long ones are maybe 14 feet long, and then those are the horizontal, and then the vertical posts, essentially. Those ones are maybe 2x4s or 2x6s that are 8 feet long. So if I was in like my own studio or shop space or outside where I'm tanning hides, one of the things that I'll do is build the frame a little bit stouter in some ways, so that it's like lashed together at the corners, or I'll use actual logs, because I'll work on it for like 12 or 16 hours straight. As the hide dries, it's going to keep pulling harder and harder and harder, so that frame needs to be even more stout. The frame is finished. We're going to work with the hide on the ground since we have plastic and it's clean, and we'll stretch the hide out kind of like we had on the plywood earlier, and we'll lace it to the frame while it's here, because it's easier to reach all the sides and pull really hard than when you have something that's 8 feet above your head. I'll be cutting holes about every 6 inches apart, and then I'll have somebody else come behind me with the rope and just lace up the hide. You can see along this edge already, like we can use these holes. So we're going to use this rope. We're going to do a rope for each edge, and it makes it just makes it easier, because otherwise you have to feed rope the whole entire length when you're going to tighten something. So what I want you to do is find the middle point of that rope and have it be the middle point of the board. This is about the middle of the hide, the middle of the board. And so I'm just going to bring it to about the middle. And now you're only having to work with 50 feet of rope instead of 100 feet of rope. You start on the end and string through. But you always want to come up from underneath the hide, and then always over the board, underneath. So it's a whip stitch. Mm-hmm. This is a good partner thing. One person can be sewing and the other person can be pulling. Go like that. And then you have an approximate middle point. I'll go around and I'll make holes, and so like here, these 3 here, that's one, and that's one. And I didn't have to cut it already. And then I'll put one here.
Is there an ideal distance that you'd like to have between the holes?
It's about 6 inches. If you do it too close, it's like perforation and it just rips through. If you do it too far apart, you're not getting a good stretch. So you're trying to evenly disperse all of that pressure by your distancing. You don't want to take your knife and cut perpendicular to the edge. You want to be parallel, so that when it's pulling, you're not providing a tear mark for it just to rip out. The pressure will want to run sideways rather than in line with it. That's exactly right, Monica. You just want to make sure that you're not twisting as you go. It just makes it easier. Okay. So it's about 6 inches apart here, and then they are doing the proper going over the board, underneath the hide, up and through each time. So it creates a whip stitch, and it makes it nice for pulling the rope through. And the holes are about a 1/2 inch away from the edge, or a little bit more, because sometimes if there's a hole like this one here was already in the hide, then we just use that. If you want to sit on hide or kneel on hide, there's a towel, and that'll help suck the water out of the hide too, which is helpful.
So it goes...
Can you see how this is twisted?
So it goes under there.
So we need to make sure that we correct any mistakes like that straight away. So we're going to put the rope underneath, and then there's no crossing over.
So they ran on a rope on this side without reaching quite to the end, but what's going to happen is the hide is kind of tapped in place essentially, and when the other side that's parallel, when that gets laced in, then when we go to pull the rope, we'll start pulling on this side, and that will create the extra feet of rope length needed to lace up the rest. Because this hide right now is relaxed, it's going to grow by probably 3 more feet this direction and at least 2 feet that direction. So it's going to fill the whole entire frame will be the rope to the frame with the hide touching the wood probably. And that's why we need longer boards tomorrow for those vertical supports. We found the middle point of the rope, and we started threading the hide in the middle. So one side is going this direction, And if you start to then, to going towards the back, if you do that same technique moving towards the front, it's going to be like it's reversed. So because it's mirrored. And that achieves the same spiral pattern all the way through the hide. The whole hide has been strung up and it's kind of tacked in place. Essentially, like it's nice and square. And so now we're going to start stretching the hide. And to do that, we've been talking about the holes in the fibers. Once you put a cut through the fibers, it tends to want to run that way. So what we're going to do is use our hands on either side and be pulling, and then have another person who's pulling the rope as well, instead of just pulling on the rope, because that's putting all the pressure on that one little spot, versus now we spread it out across like 12 inches of surface area. And that will give a lot more stretch to the hide. And then now, I mean, I just gained that much rope. So since there's teams of us working, we're gonna work the two narrower side, which would be the head and the neck head and the rump tail side. We're gonna pull from each other, tighten those ends up, and then we're gonna work the longer, like 14-foot lengths at the same time pulling against each other. We'll go narrow ends first and then longer ends second, and then do it again. So when working on a moosehide and you have a number of people helping you on a frame, you basically have a team of people for each side where one person or two people are working the edges, and then you have a couple people working in the middle when it's like this. And you can have 2, even 3 people, as many will fit, sitting on the middle of the hide, sitting there scraping like this. And the body weight, and every time you move, you're using your body weight to pull and push instead of just your hands leaning against it when it's upright. So we're gonna show a couple different techniques here this week. And today's process, what we're doing, since we're gonna have to take it off the frame in about an hour and a half, is going to be really just working on moving the water from the middle out to get as much stretch as we can, and then we'll roll it up, fold it up, and put it in the freezer, and we'll get an earlier start tomorrow.
So you're actually pulling the hide with your hands?
Yeah, I'm pulling with my hands and the rope. I'm going to wrap my fingers to where I have like my pinky and my ring finger on the rope here, and then I kind of dig my index finger and my middle finger and clamp over with my thumb to pull. Pulling from 2 spots helps get more stretch. As I'm pulling, Andrea's also pulling the rope and she's feeding it. So now there's lots of excess here, and now she's feeding it this direction. And like this hole here hadn't been laced before because we didn't have enough rope, and now we have enough rope. We want to do the ends first because there's going to be a lot more stretch from belly to belly than there is from end to end. So by really anchoring in place on the neck and the butt, then when you go to pull from the sides, it's not moving around. So the amount you can see that stretches is like kind of from here to here, maybe 1.5 feet, 24 inches, that is actually stretching substantially that you can visually see. So from here to here on this side, and also on the other side, only leaves about a 2-foot section in the middle that's not really stretching a whole lot. But from the narrow sides, if you come in 2 feet on each side, now there's an 8-foot section in the middle that didn't get stretched as much, and that's the thickest part of the hide. It's the spine that's the hardest part to get stretch in. So that's why we start on the 2 narrow sides for stretching first, and then move to the long sides. So we just ripped a hole, which is fine. The belly, belly is thin on this side, it's really thin, and they've already been tightening on that side. So if we can get enough here to catch this one, then we'll just go to here. Yeah, that.
So you just looped it round and now you're tying a knot?
Oh, yeah. So I mean, that can't slide through anymore, so we really do have to keep this as a middle point, but now we didn't have to get a small piece of rope. So you can do that a certain number of times. The other thing that happens is that the board that I'm kneeling on right now, or elbowing on, it starts to bow.
At what point do you stop stretching? Like how big do you want this to be? Is like an optimum size? Or?
It's really until the hide doesn't give you any more movement. And like we started ripping out on this side, we're probably gonna stop stretching for today. We put the frame to where now it's in a more vertical orientation so that people can work on both sides easier. and we can have more people working, and we'll do more body weight leaning into it instead of sitting on it for right now. And we can really work from the middle and squeegee that water and have gravity help feed it. And then tomorrow we might get the blocks up to where we're sitting on it. So right now we're really just trying to squeegee the water out, and that'll be a good goal for today. So it's really leaning like full body weight into it, and it holds. I can push really hard, and you can see those lines that are created here, or there's the edge of the tool. That's not going to cut through the hide, that's okay. But on some of the spot where there's holes or it's really thin, if you push really hard at that point, it will go through. So we do want to be cognizant of that. I'm going to make some bone tools tonight that are curved so that you can push really hard and there's not edges cutting into the hide. And the nice thing about this scraping process is like there's a piece of the plywood that's stuck right there. That just comes off. And some of like dirt or little spruce needles that are on there, they're just going to scrape right off. And you can see now, this is much looser than it was when we started, and we might need to grab the rope and pull a little bit as we keep scraping. Both sides are evaporating from the hide. You want to be working on both sides because the other side needs to be scraped too. So the general idea is to have the hide dry as uniformly as possible. So you're going to start from the middle, which is the wettest, and work your way out. But the edges do dry more rapidly, so you have to be mindful and kind of feeling how the edges are doing. It might take a pause and really work an edge, or even maybe dampen your hands and put a little bit of extra water there just to slow it down if you're not able to get to it. One of the things, if you just sit there and work one spot thinking that you're going to get it soft until it's finished, it doesn't actually happen that way. It needs to relax and kind of work out that water because it needs to work from the middle out. If we were just to towel dry the whole thing, and they're like, oh, we're done, and they come back an hour later and the outside's going to be wet again, that top layer will become wet. Part of the purpose of working from the middle out is to move that moisture to the edges and have the edges wick out the moisture and then keep them from becoming crunchy. So when you work the edges, that helps create a little bit of heat from the friction and dries out the water, and then it makes it more soft as you're working it. And then you work from the middle again and bring the water out to that edge, and then you do it again. So we've been working the hide, and it's relaxing, so we're taking out more of the slack. I'm using a new tool, which is just a leg bone of a moose, the lower part. You can push really hard. And this isn't really squeegeeing water, it's really just breaking in the fibers and pushing and stretching. So this is a really good tool to use for those edges because there's no sharpness to it. So some of the edges like this right here, this really thin part, is actually starting to already get a little crunchy. And so when we wrap it up in about 30 minutes, put it in the freezer, those edges we put in the middle and then re-encase and they'll get hydrated again. The other thing too is you can see with the light behind, there's like, looks like dots here, and that's where someone kind of gouged out little parts of hide on the back. Yeah. This is thin, but it's also getting drier. So as like this is a stage where it's not sopping wet like here, like this is still fuzzy, you can still see the lines that I'm putting in it, where down here like this is really stretches, and that's a good sign. And so we're gonna have to like tomorrow really work that because this is gonna dry out like as the first thing that's gonna dry out. So because the hide as we scrape it keeps getting looser, what you can do to help absorb some of that slackness in the middle is give it like your whole forearm while you're pushing like down here. And now it's tighter. We're really just trying to stretch out this middle section, and that's why we're getting all this extra slack in the sides and the bottom. And that's why we need those taller boards for tomorrow and to block it up because we're not going to be able to reach up there. So we're going to keep doing the scraping for a while. There's other techniques that we'll do to help maybe thin the hide in some spots and keep it's like breaking it in different ways. So we're going to untie the three sides except for the top so that the hide doesn't fall, and that's why we're working. And then we'll work one side over and take out the hide from the top. And then we'll fold it up and put all the edges towards the middle, and then fold it again and roll it up. And then these edges that are starting to get a little dry, they'll start to get some of that moisture from the middle, and we'll put it in the freezer overnight. And then tomorrow morning, as soon as I wake up, I'll take it out of the freezer. This won't be frozen all the way overnight, and because there's less water in it, it's not going to freeze as crunchy as it did when I first put it in there. So the towel just keeps the hide, it'll slow down the freezing process in the freezer, and it helps the hide breathe too when like if we're thawing it out, so that it's not just plastic against the hide. I don't like that. The hide needs to breathe. it's ready to now have some oil rubbed into it. It's a little bit fuzzy right now from the sanding, and the oil will help kind of make it less fuzzy, and then it'll start to impart some oils into the hide. So this, the steel needs to be oiled to get the rest of the rust and the metal off of it before we put the hide on it. And what I like to do when I'm using metal is use like a rag and make sure that the rag comes off clean before we touch it with the hide. You can see that when we first applied oil, how dirty the paper towel was. And now we're trying to wipe off the oil and it's a lot cleaner. And the oil is just acting as a solvent to remove anything that's the rust and the metal, the dirt off the metal that's oil soluble. We could use a solvent like gasoline or brake cleaner, but then that would go into the hide and all of us, so we're just using coconut oil. And that will help the hide. The hide is wet and this is steel, so that helps the steel not rust as we use it. When I got home last night, I put the hide in the freezer, just wrapped in the towels, and it got cold and frozen, and at, what time is it now? 2:15, 2:30? So about 3 hours ago, we took the hide out and just had it in the sink at room temperature in a deep sink, and took the towels off just to let the air temperature start to thaw it out. And so it still feels cold, but it's flexible enough to start unrolling. And the other nice thing about working with the hide when it's frozen, and you can, is that sometimes you get chunks of ice. And if the ice falls out, then you just had all that water that would have been in the hide and needed to dry, came off as a big chunk of ice. So that's one of the things that's helpful about using a freezer. And you can see that our edges that we folded in here have been like a burrito, they're softer than they were yesterday, and they've kind of rehydrated a little bit. And the hide does feel more even. So we can peel it apart and brush off any ice crystals that might be there. The other thing that's helpful about freezing it is that the expansion of the water molecules as they freeze water expands, and that helps stretch the hide and push apart those fibers on a very small molecular level. This now feels really wet, and yesterday it was a lot drier, so that's a good thing. We got that moisture back to the edges. And what I'm going to do is just pull it back and forth over the wood. And I can use this corner here that we were talking about earlier to really work it if it needs more pressure in one spot concentrated, or if it's a broad area, I can just go back and forth like that. And once we've gone over the whole hide and done that a little bit, then we'll take the frame out of the way and lace up the hide again and start working in the middle. And we could do this with the middle, but we might as well let the frame have all that extra pressure of the ropes pulling than try and use just our shoulder strength across this. On the standing side with the metal, they're going to do the same thing, it's just not in a sitting position. And that way we have 4 people working on it instead of just 2. Like what you can see what Helen's doing, she's pulling it down, where I'm having to use a different action of my hands. That's pushing with my shoulders, and then what she's doing is pulling down. So you're using different muscle groups. Right now, the wood and the metal are acting to serve the same purpose. We're just stretching the hide. There's too much moisture in the hide for them to be very different right now. The goal is just to go around the whole edge and work those parts of the hide that get more crunchy, which is the edge, that have the holes on it, where when we lace it up, it's hard to work those spots when there's a rope in the way. We just flip the hide over to work the other side. So now we're going to exfoliate the other side a little bit more, because what we're doing, when you buy commercial leather, like for a leather motorcycle jacket, that has the epidermis layer actually on it. That's what gives it the grain texture. We've cut off that and scraped off the epidermis layer, so now it's going to be fluffy, kind of like suede is. So we're getting the hide placed in the middle to where it's even, and then we'll lace it up the narrow sides first, and then go up the longer side second, and then we'll start to pull it tight.
Are you worried about the holes tearing?
They do tear. That's normal. Eventually they will tear, and it's okay. We just make a new one or work around it. So these ropes are about 100 feet long. I usually start in about the middle of each section and work my way out.
and that just makes it to where you only have to string 50 feet at a time instead of having to work with 100 foot of rope. It's important to always be consistent with how you're lashing. So that's when we're stringing it up and lacing, it's important to do a whip stitch that's always going the same direction so it doesn't bind on itself.
It's tacked in place well enough now to where it's not going to be moving around, so we can go ahead and start pulling and getting our sides stretched more. Okay, you can pull. So we ran out of rope because we made the frame substantially larger, and we made the frame a little bit larger than it needed to be because we're not getting any more stretch. So what we're going to do is unscrew this whiteboard behind me and move it in about 1.5 feet maybe, and that'll give us a lot more rope, and we'll be able to finish tying up the rest of the hide. Okay, so this part of the hide is kind of ripply right now, so I'm going to undo it from here a little bit, and then we'll tie it to the bottom part first because we got more tightened today than we did yesterday, and that will help pull out those ripples. So that's one of the things, you don't want ripples when the hide should be flat, is the goal. So it's all tightened in place, and we're going to raise it up so we can start working on it now. And we'll lift it up and then put the back supports in, and then we'll start scraping, and as people are scraping, we'll keep tightening the ropes. We're going to start scraping in just like we did the first day. We brought in some stone tools today, and it's just kind of similar. This fits my hand nice, that's why I picked it up off the beach when I was walking out there. And this is just a nice rounded corner that's kind of porous. So this is good for working in the edges, and I can push with it. We still have our same bone tool that we were using yesterday that kind of does the same thing to push with. And then I have the wooden tool. This is the one we just made that's just a quick kind of crude wooden tool, and it's the same kind of scraping action except it has a much wider of a point, and I can lean into this harder than we were using the ice scrapers yesterday. So the edges, we're just trying to really work them and keep them from getting crunchy before they're soft. So we're working the water out to the edges and pulling and pushing those fibers to break. Helen was saying, as you can see, like when she's scraping, it's starting to turn white. Like this area, you can see the kind of the lines that she was making. Those are what we're trying to go for, and the whole hide needs to get white like that. And so she's using the slate tool, and it has more edges and it's sharper, and it's breaking up those fibers more, and it has more of a cutting action. So as you're pulling, you want to do an even pressure, where you start on and then you come off. If you just like lean in sideways, you might put a cut. So this right here is an example of what we're trying to look for texture and color-wise. And it doesn't feel dry yet, so it's not there, but the texture and color is correct, and we want to make sure that we don't lose that. Some of the spots are really starting to dry out more on the edges, and so I'm going to work oil into it. If you don't work the oil in while the hide is drying, it'll just sit on top, and it won't penetrate as deeply. So the oil needs to work in while the water is coming out. And so that's what I'm going to kind of do while everyone's scraping. I'm just going to, from the back side, work in oil. And I have a big blob of oil in my hand, and then I'm putting some on and working it in. So I'm not drenching it. But then as people scrape, the scraping action will act as friction and heat and work it into the hide more. So I'm just gonna...
What kind of oil is that?
This is just coconut oil. We could use seal oil or fish head oil or moose tallow or... This also slows down the drying process because the water has to work its way through an oily film. We want the water to come out, and we want the moisturizing quality of oil to go in. And I'm just going to work oil into the whole hide right now because it's a good time to do it. So if you just put oil, if you think that just soaking your hide in oil will make it soft and flexible at the end, that's not true. It'll make a really oily, hard mess. So I'm just putting as much as the hide wants to accept, which is a little bit at a time. And we'll do this a couple of times, or a few times, until it feels like it doesn't want anymore throughout the process. Because it needs time to accept it. And then working it in with the wooden tools, because the wood really helps to absorb the oil and then transfer it back into the hide. We're at kind of a stopping point today, and we'll take down the hide, unstring it, and then roll it up like we did yesterday and put it in the freezer. And tomorrow the hide should be ready for some more tools, the moose tooth tool that I made today, and using the slate more, and we might bring in some wire brushes too. So this would take about 12 to 16 hours for 2 days of work.
We took the hide out of the freezer about 30 minutes ago, and we unrolled it, and now we're just letting it thaw out faster. So we're using the heat from our feet and pulling on it to help stretch and expose it all to the warm air so it can thaw out to be able to stretch. And there's a big difference. Yesterday it took about 3 hours to thaw out the hide, and today it's been like 30 minutes, and the hide is flat. So there's a lot less moisture in the hide today, and that's an indicator of it by how long it takes to thaw. It also feels lighter taking it out of the freezer today, and the hide is starting to get, the edges are turning a different color, and it gradates back to more moisture in the middle. After we took it off the frame last night, I took it to the KPC language class, and we worked on it, and we did a lot of the handwork on the bench frame that I'd made, going back and forth across it. I scraped all the edges with the slate twice on both sides, and then we pulled it. There was about 8 of us holding on to it, and then I was laying on the middle, and they were throwing me up in the air and catching me and sliding me around. And so that's what we did yesterday for about an hour and 15 minutes. And then we rolled it up with the edges in, rolled it up, and put it in the freezer last night at about 8:30. So because of how far along we got last night with the language class, we're going to block up the frame and be sitting on it and scraping using our body weight of sitting on it to help stretch the hide more. One of the things that's important when working on the hide is that top layer, it gets drier, and then if you don't let the hide rest for a little bit, the top just dries out and the middle stays moist and then gets hard. And so that's an important thing if we work on the hide for like 3 hours to let it rest. And that might mean at this stage taking it off the frame and rolling it up like we do to freeze it at night and just letting it relax for a little bit. It could be 30 minutes. And then what will happen is those edges that originally felt really hard will get moisture back into them, and that's a good thing because we're wanting to just wick out the moisture from the middle. And if you don't give it time, you can't wick it out properly. So when I'm working on a hide by myself, I might need to let it rest twice. But usually what happens is I will stretch it out and scrape and scrape and scrape like we've been doing for the last 2 days, and then I roll it up and let it rest overnight, and then the next day I'll stretch it out again on the frame and be working on it. And then for maybe, it might take like 4 or 8 hours to work on it like that. And then I'll take it off the frame, let it rest, and then do handwork from that point on. They'll reach a stage where the frame will no longer allow us to soften the way that it needs to go, because we really need that stretching from all directions, and we can't do that on the frame. The frame is really just pulling in a little bit of directions, but you can't do this with it. And that's important. So there's 2 opportunities for it to rest minimum when I'm working on it by myself. Overnight, and then when I'm done with the framework. So this is the moose tooth scraper that I was talking about yesterday. I glued teeth into here, and the teeth are sharp. This is a piece of stainless steel that I took a cutting torch to and just kind of melted and made really gnarly. But the idea behind it is just to have a rough surface that we can push on the hide with that has a handle. The slate works really well. It doesn't have the most ergonomic shape. I only have 1 piece, so I'm not going to break it to try and make it nicely shaped. But these will hopefully be more ergonomic, and we can shave down the handle a little bit if it needs to. You could do the same thing with bone, but just cutting teeth into the bone. And that's what the other bone we've been using kind of has. But those are already smoothing out. And we would want to sharpen them essentially each time. But we're just going to we can use these for it. There's a point where we're actually trying to still scrape off a little bit of the top. You can see it right here, this darker part, that will kind of come off. And when you remove that, it kind of frees the fibers to bend better, and it will dry out in a different way, in a good way. So this section here kind of illustrates the stages of dryness. This is kind of the milky clear white, and it has the most moisture in it. And then over here, this is the membrane that can be scraped off. And then it's a little wetter than over here where it's the most dry. So we're working the edges right now, and it serves 2 purposes. 1, we're thawing out the hide, and then 2, when we're on the frame is being stretched and maybe having a little bit of downward pressure. We really need to be doing this to it, and you can see how that isn't really possible on a frame because you can't get all those different angles happening. And then we also have our leg, so you can just pull over the knee and still do that downward pressure like we did on the frame. And the nice thing too is that like your pants will absorb some of the moisture out of the hide. And pass to your neighbor so that the hide will get softened by everybody a little bit differently, which is good. As we do this, it migrates the water to the surface from the middle rather than just letting it slowly dry out. So if you take the edge and roll it up like that, and then when you go to twist and move the hide, now you're moving all of those fibers and you're really amplifying your work.
And you're getting some of that moisture.
Yep. Yeah. You're keeping the edge encased and you're moving moisture. Then when you go to move, you're holding onto something rather than just trying to pinch it. You have like a handle. The hide is thawed out enough for us to stretch it and have it stretched. It's relaxed, it's warm. And then we're just moving the hide around to let everyone have a chance to feel all the edges from when we started to where we're at now. The edges should feel a little bit more damp now, and they should be a lot more flexible and more soft. We're just going under the hide, Jimmy, with the board.
So
on top of the frame, but under the hide.
Okay.
So just like that.
And then on top of this?
And then on top of that.
Like through here?
Yep. What we want to be doing is sitting on top of the hide, and because this is such a long distance, I put a support board in between, and then we'll block up the hide or the frame to where it's elevated so we can sit on it and not be touching the floor. So I'm going to start with the teeth first, and the teeth just have all the abrasive surface, so I'm just going to run it around. I'm not putting a lot of pressure because the teeth are kind of sharp, and you can see how it's already putting lines in it. When I'm working the edges, I'm going off the hide, not coming back because it's just going to get clogged up. And the other thing that I like to do too is you can pull on the ropes to give tension between them. It's breaking down fibers and it's abrading the surface. They're starting to get a little bit duller the more that we use them, but it still does a really good job of scraping, and I'm using it on the edges because the edges are harder. There can be a membrane in some spots like right here where you can see the darker kind of smooth. It needs to be fuzzy like over here, and there's a spot there where my index finger is. That's what we're trying to remove. Where my pinky is good. And so if I go here, it removes a lot more of it. And while I'm doing this, I'm pushing, and the weight of me moving is stretching the hide in all directions. So this is the stainless steel scraper, and I can do a spiral action. This area over here is drier, and so that's part of what I'm looking for is a color change. And I'm moving around because this isn't perfectly even, so it's more of a spiral action, so that I'm not just creating lines and going over, because I will carve through the hide eventually. So if I were to keep just doing this. And that's just to really make it soft and suede, velvety surface. Like this is soft enough. It looks like suede. It feels like suede. Any membranes have been scraped off, and this is where I'd switch to just using a wooden spreading tool, stretching tool. So we'll go over the edges first for right now, and then we'll work our way into the middle. And then after we do the edges, we'll tighten the ropes again, and then kind of turn around and face the middle and work the middle. And then if someone sits over here, it's going to stretch the hide even more. Here, the hide is touching the ground. I wouldn't work that spot between Jasmine and I. We're going to work the edge so that it's suspended in the air. And if you work against the concrete, it's not stretching because it's just scraping. And when you work in the air, each time you push down, it's bending all those fibers. So you really want to be exfoliating or abrading, spreading, stretching all at the same time. And I can use the stone to do the same action. So where Monica's scraping right now is a membrane that can be pulled off. It's also a little bit more moisture, and so you can see how it's not really scraping as much because the water is acting kind of as a cushion. So she can push a little bit harder and it won't damage the hide as much because it has more moisture in it. And then if you move to more of her right, where you see it's very dry, that would need less scraping.
Just a little light.
Just a light kind of scratching the surface, and then she could switch to like the wooden tool for right there. And
Right here. Oh, yeah.
and then that's just really spreading out the fibers more, and it's just a more gentle of a exfoliant. And I'm going to work a couple more minutes on this section to my left, and Jasmine's been and Sarah have been kind of working one spot for about 5 minutes, and now we should rotate and work the edges. And it's what I was talking about before, where if we just work one side the whole time, it needs a chance to relax, and then the moisture will work its way back up and we'll come back to it. And then otherwise, the other side gets crunchy as well. So it's important just to work our way around. It also gives our hands a break while we're moving. Well, the edges are much drier, and you can see the color change here where it's like kind of almost white and really soft and fuzzy, and it gradates over here to more of a transparent color. And when we take the tool here, you can see that's a kind of gouge that it makes, and if I go over here, that's a whiter scratch mark. So this still has a lot of water in it, and it's much stretchier than over here. So you can either take a wooden spreading tool, really push into the hide and stretch it. At some point, we are going to need to move this board so we can address the hide that's under it. But if we didn't have the board in there, we wouldn't have the tension that we needed. We'd have to try and pull the hide so tight that it would just rip out. So the board is helpful. So I'm just taking the tooth tool and working it in really broad, quick strokes with a fair bit of pressure because this has a lot of moisture still in it, just to break up that surface and start to make it a little bit fluffier. And that will help the moisture work its way out and make the hide even stretchier, which makes it softer. So I wouldn't sit here and just work in one small area. It's just big strokes. And then I could take the wooden, and I'm using my full upper body weight on this. And I would never be able to apply this much pressure when the hide was vertical, like we were working yesterday on the frame in the air. We've been sitting on the hide for a while and stretching and spreading it out, and we need to take some of the slack of the rope in, and so we're just going to be tightening the ropes like we did yesterday while we were scraping. This is a very critical point for the hide, and it needs to be worked constantly now, so we're going to take lunch in shifts so that there's always a person working on the hide. And that's really important because if we were to leave this right now, it would just get crunchy and dry because the top is doing a really good job wicking now. All those little fibers that we're loosening up, they act as little wicks. And we need to be putting pressure while it's drying. So we'll have to do this constantly. And if we were to stop, we would have to unlace the whole thing, wrap it up, put it in the freezer in a plastic bag this time to try and stop the drying as much as possible. And that would take another hour, and then it wouldn't make sense. So we're just walking around the hide to give it pressure and stretching from all the different sides, and this is a lot more weight than we could have done yesterday, like leaning into the hide, and it's much easier on your hands just to use your feet to walk around. It's still pretty wet here, and this is really helpful because the spine part is so hard to stretch that using the body weight to move it around is a really good thing. We are going to flip the whole frame over and do the same thing to the other side of the hide, because we haven't abraded the other side yet. And when we flip it over, we'll tighten the ropes again, put the board back in, and then do it all over again. And then after we've done that, the next step would be to unstring it and then do the handwork and also have a cable out and drag it across the cable or that steel frame that we had yesterday to really pay attention to what each part feels like. This is just a really doing the whole hide quickly, covering everything, but it's harder to address specific areas where you need to do this too. So that'll be the next stage. But we need this middle section here to be similar to the outside before we do that. So we've flipped the hide over, like we had talked about, and we're working the other side. And we have a 4x4 in the middle because we broke the 2x4 by 3 of us standing around it. And the nice thing with the 4x4 is it elevates the hide more to where now there's tension and it's like a drum now because we're not touching the ground at all. now we're scraping the other side with all the scraping tools and the spreading tools, and the hide, you can see how more of it's a uniform white color as the moisture is going out of it. So as the hide is drying out, it becomes less stretchy. So towards the edges, they're not really stretching anymore. They can still be softened. We can still get quite a bit of stretch out of this middle section because it has a lot of water still in it. But as we work the edges, it's gonna get less and less stretchy. And that's a good sign. So we're wanting to, we don't have to worry about the edge here. We're gonna be trimming off at least 1/8 of an inch all the way around. We're trying to help the areas that lead up to the edge. This is the last part of the hide that is really wet, and you can see the color of it, where this is drier and white, and this is a different color here that's darker. So that's a wet patch. This is the thickest part of the hide, and will take the longest to dry. So I've been working at that, making sure we keep spreading it as we're softening the rest of the surface of the hide. I'm just using my body weight to really pull those fibers, stretch them, thin it out. Because if we can stretch to thin versus cutting or scraping away thinning, we get more hide, more leather at the end. So I prefer stretching rather than just shaving. It's more work, but you get more hide at the end. Like that on both sides of the 4x4 to help. And another way to do it would be have, like, Sarah, if you were to walk closer to me, and I'll stand over here. And then you walk back and I'll walk forward. So if we just were to kind of in tandem go like that, then we're not putting as much pressure on one spot so the frame doesn't break. So we're at a stage now where we're gonna kind of switch to mostly using the wooden tools because the hide, we're stretching it quite substantially and it's thinner, it's getting thinned out the more that we stretch and spread it out. And because people were learning on this hide, there's a lot of thin spots that we can't necessarily see because there's not light underneath it. And when you have those more scraping tools, they may put a hole in it. So we still have a lot of exfoliating to do and abrading to do. And so we're gonna kind of tone it down for a little bit and then just keep working at spreading it and drying out the hide more rather than removing material as much. So we just moved the center board because we needed to address this part here. You can kind of see two ridge lines, and that's because it's kind of drying around the board, and that's not being stretched the same way that we've been doing everything else. So now we just moved it over to the right about a foot. And we'll work this middle section, and it will be a little bit more water trapping that may have happened around that. The 2x6 that we were using before had a dirty spot on it that I didn't wipe off ahead of time, so the dirt just kind of got rubbed into the fuzzy part of the hide. So when we wire wheel the hide, that might come out, and by the time we smoke it, that will be a lot less noticeable, but we probably will still be able to see it. And the same thing with some of these spots here that were some rust that got in there. So this is an example of why you want to make sure that you make all your tools and equipment clean before you work on your hide, and why using a set of things that are set up that are for the hide work is helpful. So there was a cut in the hide when it was being scraped, and it kind of just filleted partially. So that's just some of the skin, and that could be cut off. I'm gonna work the edges with either combination of the Moosehide teeth and the metal scraper all the way around. This side needs to relax now because we worked a lot of water out of it, and then we'll flip the hide over again and work the flesh side again. Because we just tightened the ropes, I wanna let the hide kind of relax a little bit into place before we put the middle beam back in, so we don't rip the ropes from the hide. There was some warp in it before, so me walking on the sides is helping make the hide flatter, which is good. So this is starting to get more fuzzy and fluffy, and that's a good sign. And it's also, what we've been doing on the other sides, we'll go back over like a wooden tool and it'll kind of work its way off. But this is the flesh side, and the flesh side tends to stay more nappy like this than the dermis side. What I'm doing right now, you could do with a wire brush on like a handheld drill. What that drill does not do is it doesn't stretch. So that's why we're using the stone and the bone tools today. So we probably will use the drill tomorrow on it to thin out the hide. We have about another 30, 45 minutes of work time today, and we've scraped the flesh side again, and it's looking drier again. So we're gonna flip the hide over and do the flesh, or the hair side with the epidermis layer that's been removed, and do that one more time. There's no more really wet looking spots on the hide when we flipped it over. So that's a good sign that the water is coming out, and that's why we weren't really getting any more stretch out of the hide on the other side. So that middle section still has quite a bit of water in it, but it's gone past that really stretchy phase now. We're still gonna work it on the frame for a little bit and work it for about another 25 minutes. Then we're gonna have people going around the edges again with the metal tools, focusing on edges while a couple people are working on the middle. I'm just tightening up the rope real fast so that we can get a better stretch to get those beam marks out and make sure the hide is flat before it goes in the freezer. Don't stand too close to the edges when you get on. Kind of come in 1.5 feet so we don't pop all the ropes. So we're just kind of stretching the hide by using our body weight. We probably won't use the frame tomorrow, and it'll all just be handwork, judging by how dry it is. We'll see what it looks like in the morning, but we're getting close. The hide's a lot less stretchy now, and that's a good sign for the dryness. And then once the hide stops stretching, you want to get it off the frame. That's what the frame is really helping to do, is to give all that stretch. Once that has happened, then, or stop stretching, then you want to go to the handwork where we're twisting like we did at the beginning of today, and then taking it across like a cable or that steel spring steel. So I'm just feeling the hide for how stiff it is and what the moisture content is. So we're definitely not going to put this on the frame tomorrow. It's all going to be handwork. We do that rolling up and twisting. And to get it ready for night, we're going to fold the edges in. And right now it's sounding a little crunchy, and the goal for tomorrow is to work out all that crunch. We want to get those ends in there usually. And fold it over as far as you can. And I can see a spot like right here where this would be a good spot to use the wire wheel on. It's just a really thick part of the hide. It has kind of a membrane still on it that the stone scraper gets off, but the wheel would be easier. So now I need the towel, and we'll wrap it up in the towel. It'll be frozen even less hard tonight because there's way less water in it. The hide came out of the freezer, and it's not too crunchy, and we're just gonna work the edges like we did yesterday morning just to warm up the hide, and that's a lot of what we're gonna be doing today, is that twisting action and handwork. I took this out of the freezer at 9:10, and it's now 10 o'clock, so it's just been wrapped up in a towel for 50 minutes, and it's already a lot more flexible than it was yesterday. And it's cold. Like, my end is a thicker end, and so it feels cold, but there's no ice on this, and like over here is already, like, this is flexible. And so that's a really good thing. And we're just going to do kind of the same thing that Helen was showing yesterday, but just rolling up the edge and working the hide. So the next stage, once this gets thawed out a little bit more, is to trim the edge, because all the crunchy part here, it kind of keeps the hide from wanting to fold and move as nicely as it needs to. So by trimming that off, it makes the whole edge undulate better and stretch and move better.
Or I guess.
The edges are thawed out enough now to where I want to trim them. So I'm just going to be trimming this like outer 1/4 inch all the way around so that the hide is more flexible, because this edge is pretty crunchy and inhibits the softening by hand. It'll also remove the hole openings, because those aren't really going to do us any good for sewing purposes. I mean, if you do it long like this, you could use it kind of for cord. You could use them for jewelry, patching. So this is a test to see how well we did, and if it gets hard like this and it's dry all the way, that may not be able to get as soft as we want. You'd have to actually like get it wet a little bit to get it to soften, because it may have dried out in the middle, especially like on these edges. That's why like I would use this more for shoes, because it's pretty hard. It still has moisture in it though, so we might be able to get more out of it. But it's why the thinner parts feel really flexible because they've been softened all the way through. And then like right here on this cross section, we softened all the way through.
You can see how easy your knife's going through that.
Yes, and that's how easy the needle will go through too. So we're gonna go ahead and get the frame with the steel and the wood on it so we can start working it back and forth like this for some of these really hard parts. And some people can still be doing the hand movement. So I took a cutting torch to our piece of steel and I just kind of gave it teeth by just doing a cut line along it so that it can abrade the surface of the hide a little bit better. We're just rubbing it back and forth to kind of remove some of the material and also more softening. Before we keep going, I have a air filter in my truck that I'm gonna get, so we're sucking this fuzz. So we just switched to where the neck's now on the other side, and we're just gonna keep working, and it's getting softer to the touch and a little bit softer in the middle and more flexible as we go. And it just takes a few more hours of this, and then we'll see where we're at. It does still feel cool to the touch. There's still moisture in it, which is good because we still have softening to do. And that's why I have this one higher, so that I can use my body weight of my arms. Instead of just sitting here doing this, I'm like pulling with my whole weight. So after doing that back and forth motion across the steel, it makes the hide a lot more flexible. So it's not removing as much material as the scraping does. It's just really breaking in those fibers to where now, before it was just kind of this edge that was like fabric, drapey, and now we've gained like 4 inches more of movement. But I wanted to kind of work all the edges because it's a moisture content thing right now. And if we miss the window when there's still moisture in it, it won't get soft like this. So that we can get the middle section of the hide. We folded it in half, so now we can address more of the middle of the hide. Like, there you go. And leave it folded.
Push down more.
You guys can be pulling even further down.
Like
yeah.
this?
Yeah. Folding it like we were and drawing it back and forth, the whole hide does a really good job of abrading a large amount of surface, but now we kind of want to tailor it and move it around and pull it in different directions. The back and forth is only one pulling action, so now we want to get more of an extreme pull. So this time we're going to roll it up to where the edges are on the outside, so it'll be kind of folded back and forth, and then roll it, because the middle we want to have as much moisture as possible while we're softening further. So our edges are pretty much dry, and so I'd rather have the edges on the outside keeping the moisture in the middle while we're gone. I'm just seeing how the hide is going, and now I can just ball this up where before I couldn't even do that. Fold here, essentially. Like that. It's going to be like in quarters. So this needs to come like there, or I guess in thirds, and that goes like that. And then we'll put it in a towel again when it's over the break, and we might just fold the plastic over it too to keep it from drying out further. So we have a cable stretched taut between 2 vehicles, and we have the plastic covering us so we don't get the hide wet because we've been spending all this time trying to dry it slowly. And we're going to put the hide around the cable, and then we pull the hide back and forth. And this is similar to what we were doing in the Wellness Center moments ago with that spring steel piece, but this allows us to work at more extreme angles in different directions easier. This is a new cable. I've never used new cable before, so it's working the oils from the cable out. So normally I would flip it over and cable both sides, but since it is leaving some color on the skin, I'm only going to do the one side that already has color on it, and then we go to scrape it, more of that color should scrape off the hide. So cable usually has grease in it, and if it's something like aluminum, it's going to be soft, and that's actually going to color your hide. So you want to have something that's been maybe used before or thoroughly degreased before you use it on your hide. If it's stainless, that's great, because then it's not going to rust. But if you're trying to get the grease out, you have to get it out and then get it dry or it'll rust. So that's why there's grease in cable, is to keep it from rusting. So you want to make sure that it's clean and rust free. there's spots of this that are starting to get a little bit crinkled and the middle is drying out and becoming pretty crunchy. And so we're just really trying to apply a lot of stretching pressure on the corners of the wooden part so that we don't have to re-stretch the whole hide or jerry-rig re-stretching the hide to get those spots from wrinkling. And we're gonna do this for a little bit and then get the wire wheel tool out and do that. But I just wanted to get a little bit more of a stretch before it dries anymore. At this stage, it's a little bit too dry to put oil in. Jasmine and I put a little bit of coconut oil into the hide right after lunch, but it started to, you could see it was sitting on the top a little bit too much and just kind of getting into that suede-y part, and it discolors the hide a little bit. And so the hide feels conditioned and full, so it doesn't really need more oil right now, so I'm not concerned about it. We put on quite a bit of oil that first time, and it was a good amount. Knowing when to put the oil in is kind of it can be a little bit tricky. The main thing is there needs to be enough moisture in the hide to where the oil can travel and replace. If it sits on the top and it's not going in and starts to look shiny, that's not a good thing. The hide shouldn't look shiny when you're putting the oil on.
So if you can hear this, this is the areas that we're trying to work on and we're trying to get softer. Whereas here, where it's lovely and soft, there's just no crunch sound.
So we're getting ready to kind of thin out the hide, and we're going to use a wire cup brush that is not braided, and it is designed for a corded or cordless drill. It is not for an angle grinder. So the RPMs for an angle grinder are like 30,000 or 20,000. This can be a lot slower, and we can set the drill setting to slow down. So this is less cutting than a braided cable cut brush. So these two here that I'm moving in my left hand, these are cut brushes that are not braided. And the two in my right hand, this one here is not braided, but the thing about it is that it's spinning really fast and shooting anything that breaks off up at your eyes. So you would definitely want to wear safety goggles with this, and it's just a lot more hazardous to do that. And then this one here is a braided cable that is designed for an angle grinder, and that is much too strong. It's designed for like cutting through metal to resurface metal. So this is what to use, and these are what not to use. So Helen's working on the neck area and near the spine, which is the thickest part of the hide. The brush is abrading another layer off much faster than like the stone slate would do, and that will kind of help thin out those spots and make it maybe a little bit easier to soften. So we've been working on the hair side, and we really need to spend more time working on the flesh side. And so we're going to flip it over and start working on the flesh side. Safety-wise, everyone with long hair who's working on this needs to have their hair back. For sections like this that are already really flexible, I wouldn't necessarily spend a lot of time with the power tool going over it because you're just really kind of thinning out the hide. The main reason to go over the power tool would be to give it a little bit of uniform color and texture. So before it didn't look like it was really taking anything off, but then it was just flinging it all over here, and when I rub my hand, all that lint comes together. It needs to be smooth, so it doesn't have to be on the ground. We could have done it vertically. I could be sitting on this right now, like on the frame like yesterday, and as long as it's smooth, just going back and forth so you make sure you aren't like sanding down a ripple edge where it's gonna put a hole. So this is something that Helen does that she told me how to do once, and I tried it, and I cut holes in my hide, so I stopped because I didn't have Helen with me to show me how to do it correctly. I touched the power tool to the middle of the hide, and I should have started on the edge. So when you're experimenting with things, it's a good idea to work on an edge piece so that if you do put a hole in it, it doesn't ruin the middle of your piece. So the wire wheels, as they get used, the wire will snap. So you're going to get little pieces of metal all over your hide. So we want to shake out the hide every once in a while to get those metal wire pieces to fall out. And then also the lint that's created, if there's just kind of a fine layer of it all over it. So every time you use the wire brush, it kicks up that dust. And then you can actually see what's left when you take off the lint. So you can see the areas that you haven't worked yet, or if a thicker spot, or the color changes. There's a spot that kind of looks scaly almost, like right here. This is why. This is what I was looking for.
Okay.
That part. And that still is very wet.
I know, that was the
That's
area.
the issue we're having. Even after we do all of this, if this patch right here seems like it's not good enough, I would take the time to get this brain wet again and re-tan this one spot. Because, or I would just definitely use this for shoes, for sure. So if we had this all stretched out on a frame and we were getting to the similar stage where it's like, this is too crunchy and I kind of feel like we're losing it a little bit, I might break out the power tools and since it's already stretched, work those spots and make them thinner. And we could have maybe done that yesterday at the Wellness Center and it might have helped us today a little bit more because it would have thinned it out and helped it dry faster. Part of what the issue is right now is that the hide dried a little unevenly and that is just, I would say, part of the process that you have to get used to. And then we're working in a lot of conditions that are varying right now with traveling, setting up, rolling up, freezing it, doing it for 2 hours at a time. It is nice to get like 6-hour chunks.
Pre-power tools and you had an area like that that needed more work in, what would you do? What would have been done?
So it would be bone scrapers, it'd be the slate. The slate is a really nice sharp stone tool for this. Or I go take the teeth back to it, and this is just, the power tools are moving much faster, and they're not dulling.
So you just need to spend more time on it? Okay.
Yep. So this is just time-saving, risk-saving action.
Okay.
It's thinning out the hide for us a little bit.
So really we should have had longer days working on it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I feel like this is a really great learning experience, too, for talking about the different scenarios you might run into, because you're not going to have the same thing happen exactly every time. So this has been helpful for teaching and for documenting the different tools and what happens if you get a spot like this and maybe you have your entire hide that's great but you have a 6-inch square that needs a power tool. And so you know that you can do this. Or maybe you have part of your hide that needs to be rebrained. The decision for rebraining comes down to, do I have a big enough piece to make what I want to make out of it before rebraining? And then I might just cut out that section. And then if I'm going to, let's say, go make a pair of shoes and it's a really thick piece of hide that needs to be rebrained, I'm going to cut out that pattern piece about 3 inches bigger than I need it and then rebrain it and work that, because as you work it, it's going to stretch and the edge is going to need to be trimmed again. And so you'll make sure that you have enough material for your pattern, and I'll just rebrain a small piece. So if I'm working on a whole hide that I haven't cut any pieces out of, and it has maybe a 24-inch circle in it that is a little too crunchy, I would get that part re-wet and rebrain that 24-inch circle in just that spot, and then work that till it's dry. And it's much easier to just work a small section of the hide like that. I wouldn't take the whole hide and re-soak the whole hide and then try and stretch the whole thing again, because I'm probably going to run into the same issue. So just localized rebraining. Some accounts that I've read say just retan the whole hide. I tend to not do that, and I've been able to get away with just doing smaller sections. So I wanted to test to see, this is still, it's still a little hard, but if I can, we found a needle in and this is just a regular sewing needle that's a sharp, it's not a leather sewing needle, but it will go through to see how hard the hide is. So this spot is still a little hard, but if I go down here, that goes right through. I mean, it's flexible, but it's not soft as over here, where that goes through really easily. And even easier over here. So that's another way to test is, does a skin sewing needle go through it? So after it's all been wire wheeled, it needs to be scraped again. And ideally, we'd be working with stone tools, but we only have the one stone. And so Sarah and I are going to start using the steel tools. And we might need to go to the beach tomorrow and find some better stones. I'm not scraping as much on the concrete against something hard. It's more in the air or on my body, to where it's having the cushion of my muscles and my pants. We're done working for the next half an hour. So we're gonna roll up the hide and we'll do the similar thing where we'll keep the edges on the top and encase the middle. But this is much more flexible than we left the Wellness Center.
But it sounds like you need to work on it again tonight.
It does. So we have the language class, and we're gonna do this one more time with the language class so that they can experience the hide. So I would just fold it like that, and then roll it up. But I wanna shake it out first, now that we just did that. So after we're done with the class tonight, we'll fold it up like we just did, where the edges are on the outside. We'll roll it back up and then put it in the freezer overnight, wrapped in a towel. There are different thicknesses from the different sized moose. So male and female moose, the male moose usually have thicker skin than the female moose because male moose are usually larger than female moose. If you get a really large female moose, that's going to be thicker skin than a really small male moose. So the gender doesn't automatically make it, oh, male moose have thicker skin always. It's more of a size thing. So the larger the moose, the thicker the skin. I have brought in some examples of deer hide, and this is one that I did, and this is like what you might see at like a beading store or a craft store, and it drapes and it's very, very flexible. And we achieved that here on the edges as well, but the whole deer is the thickness of a moose belly. And trying to get a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch thick moose hide to drape like this is a little bit unrealistic. It's just too thick. It's not. It may be soft and it may not be crunchy, but it's still not going to drape this easily. The other thing that you could do is you could skin the moose from the spine and leave the belly attached, and now you have a middle section that is this wide, that's thin. So there's ways to skin a moose to give you more flexible moose hide. The nice thing about having the spine and the harder parts a little bit stiff is when you're making boots, they stay up when they're wrapping around your legs. So that is actually an asset. This is the first moose that Helen and I did together, and it's just the body of the moose. It was a roadkill, so you're not gonna go out hunting calves, but you might get one from a roadkill. And we didn't stretch it out, and I was learning on it, and so there's still parts of this that are kind of crunchy. But I learned on something this size. And this is I would say a pretty good size piece to work on so that you can feel like you're achieving your goals and learn on it. So give yourself a break and learn on a small piece of moose, whether it's a small moose itself, or like we talked about, take a 1/4 of the hide and work a thick section and a belly so that you get to experience all of it. We took the hide last night to the language class and took the stone scrapers and the metal scrapers and kept scraping it, and we did get some nice movement. This is like almost to the middle point now of being nice and flexible. Other parts are still a little hard, like over here. It still has that hard to bend. So for the edges, we've really reached a point of this being done. There's really no more softening. We could maybe sand this to get the finish that we want, but as far as the physical manipulation and softening those fibers, this is plenty soft, so we're good. So the different parts of the body are good for different clothing items. If I were to want to make a tunic or a hood, this is a nice part for that. This has some good thickness to it, but it's flexible enough. It really bends well. It would make nice gloves, it could make mittens. It'd be really nice for that. This middle section here, where it's starting to get a little bit crunchy, that could still maybe be used for a tunic. This has enough bend in it to where this middle section got worked really well. And down here, kind of the same thing. When we get to here, where this was the neck, this is pretty thick. It's still pretty rigid. You can hear that cardboardy sound. We tested it with a needle yesterday, and the needle did go through this area. And this might need a little bit more work here on the edge because it's pretty hard. But if the needle can go through, that would be great for boots, because you don't want to overwork your boot material, because then when you walk on it, you want more time for it to wear. So if you exfoliate it thinner, you're just making your soles thinner. And if this part right here, this does feel dry, and that's a little too hard. That probably is not going to turn into a shape for a sole, so I wouldn't necessarily worry about that piece so much. It might make a really good thimble though. And so if you were to trim out the shape of a thimble from that piece there, I might soak that a little bit in water or brain water, and then just soften this little tiny piece right here to where it can be the shape of your finger, or get it wet and then dry it to the shape of like my thumb, and then dry it around a stick or my thumb, and then it's okay that it's really hard. And then just kind of going around, this is softer over here, and this is some nice thickness to it. So you might use this for maybe the calves of trousers or the upper part of a boot, where if you're walking through the woods and there's sticks and brambles that you're walking through or rose bushes, it's going to have some nice protection for your body. The thinnest part of the belly down here, this is nice and flexible. It's very thin, and I would use this for more of the porcupine quill weaving where the quills are woven onto the hide, so it has the flexibility to move and drape and doesn't create extra material for buckling when you're applying it over something. These areas would also make nice gloves for the fingers so that you have good movement in them. I would also use it maybe for fringe because it's going to be bouncing really nicely. The other thing too is that you can patch pieces together. So some of the objects that I've found in museums or looked at museums, it'll have the main body of the tunic, and then it'll have a nice triangle piece that finishes off the shape. So it's okay to patch holes, to piece things together, so the whole hide doesn't have to be like draping. The other nice thing too from a kind of a contemporary art realm is if you're wanting to make something that's sculptural or a garment or something that needs to hold its form, this will hold its form. So that's you might use that to your advantage when you're thinking about what you want to make. The other thing too that we've talked a little bit about is there are different ways to tan hides. And the method I'm showing is kind of a combination of the way that Helen and I have learned to tan hides. And I learned from Helen, and then I've also done a lot of reading and tinkering and testing. So we're doing pretty much everything that Helen is saying with some of the tips and tricks that I've learned over the years of working on it with making different tools and trying different techniques. So it's why sometimes if you're at a good stopping point like we are kind of right now, we might just take a moment and Helen and I will feel the hide and talk about it and then decide like, oh, maybe the rump section needs to have more scraping, and it's just that section and the rest of it's good. So it's taking the time to feel the hide, listen to what it wants to do, and then address those areas specifically instead of just trying to work the whole thing and having a game plan for what are you going to make out of the hide. So because I had the hide outside my truck and it's refrigerator temperature, as it comes to room temperature, I'm able to feel which parts were just cold to the touch from the air temperature and which parts had moisture still in them. So there's a few parts of the hide that now still feel like they have water in them still, so I wouldn't start smoking quite yet. And it needs to be, I would bring it across the steel a little bit more, and I'm feeling some parts that are like, oh, this felt dry a moment ago, but now it's actually, as it warms up, it's wicking water out, and the edges that feel really nice and soft, as they pull the water out from the middle, and they get water and they'll get crunchy. So we still actually need to work the edges a little bit for the parts that are near the more damp pieces. This is one right here that needs to be.
As you can see.
So this part here, as it's drying, it looks like the blood's kind of coming to the surface and it's stained a little bit, and that's why this is hard, is there still was a little bit blood left in the hide. And if there's blood left in the hide, it's going to stay hard, and it's harder to soften. So that's part of why this is happening. I've done this with hides where I've actually smoked them. I've stretched them out before I brained them, and I've smoked them, and then rehydrated them and brained them. And from the books that I've read, that can help make it softer by smoking it first, braining, and then re-smoking it. As this is now like room temperature, there's still too much water in here, and so if we were to smoke this right now, it would get hard because the water would just dry, and those fibers wouldn't have been being stretched while it was drying. So that's why, to make sure before it goes into the smoker that you've stretched it and you've softened it as much till it's dry. We're working in the areas that's still kind of crunchy, and we're trying to get it really over a corner or over the edge of this to really bend and stretch those fibers that are in the middle of the hide. Wire wheeling doesn't stretch, it just kind of exfoliates. Cabling or putting across a rope is really good for doing that because you have that really sharp, round corner, essentially, that you're going over back and forth. And we're trying to achieve that same process with steel here. This here works similarly to the cable if you bring the hide perpendicular and pull down to where there's this edge that you're really putting those fibers over a 90-degree corner. So if you're using a cable, you want it attached to 2 posts or 2 vehicles or something that's not going to move. Make the cable really tight and then pull it straight down or straight horizontally. You want the hide working back and forth in line with itself. If you go off to the sides, you're not getting the same angle that you really want. You really want them to be moving back and forth in line with each other.
So we couldn't find a cable that was clean enough, so we got a ratchet strap and a come along, and we're essentially doing the same cabling process, and it's helping, I would say, quite a bit actually to break those fibers. It's not really removing any material, it's just softening and bending more. We're feeling it before and after, so that's the thing when you're testing. You want to see like how hard does this feel, work an area, and then feel that same area again. And so it's bending more now. So the ratchet strap or the cable is a good time to use that is when the hide is still flexible. It needs to be able to bend easily. So a little bit higher moisture content than when we did it from the laces at the DWC the last day, or now where we've softened it quite a bit and it's able to bend quickly. And this really rapid movement helps break the fibers down, and it's because it's doing like a 180 almost. So ideally, we probably should have done this in between days working at the wellness center, where after our first day of having it all stretched out, we could have done this to the whole hide and then re-stretched it, spread it, scraped it some more, undone it from the frame, and then cabled it or ratchet strapped it again, and then done all the scraping of the rocks and then bring it to the ratchet straps. That was one of the limitations of being at the DWC, is we didn't have this really as a good option. So we're still working that area along the spine and those thick parts of the hide that still have actually have a little bit of moisture in them, and they're drying kind of crunchy, and we want to work it very quickly before it dries. So that's the nice thing about this method. It's very fast to go over the whole hide and stretch it really quickly. The other nice thing about it is it's addressing the edges. Since the edges are wicking away the moisture, while the moisture is wicking, we're drying it out from the edges while the edges are still moving, so they're not getting crunchy. So what we're doing right now is what we did Tuesday night with the college language class, and it's really what the hide needed. After we'd stretched it, on the laces, it's all being pulled taut, and you're only getting one type of stretching action happening. And then we took it off the frame and took it to class, and we did this for about an hour. And then the hide was soft again. And we should have done that on Wednesday night after the hide was pretty dry and done being on the frame. Right away, we should have done it. And the time of unlacing was enough rest time to make it ready, because you need the hide to kind of have the moisture move, and then it's ready for this action. This can be done at multiple stages of the process. When the hide's really wet, this isn't the right time to do it. But once the hide starts to dry, you can start doing this action. When we're doing something like in a workshop setting or a learning teaching setting, we just got to figure out how to make it work. And like I was saying earlier, there can be 15 different ways to make this work. And it's finding which set of those combinations will work for the scenario we have right now. It's 45 degrees outside, it's highly humid. We're working in a space that has in-floor heat today, where yesterday we're working with ventilation with fans blowing on the hide. So all those factors are different than if I'm just in one spot stationary by myself. So that's just part of the learning process. And to me, it really shows there are so many different ways to tan hides or soften hides that you just have to do whatever combination is localized to where you're at. Because if you go to Fairbanks and it's dry in the middle of winter doing this, it's gonna be different. If you go to the southeast, it's gonna be humid everywhere all the time. So it's just gonna be different hide work. We just finished scraping it with stones for the day, and we're back to the ratchet strap. And it's a lot less crinkly, the sound is different, and it's touching the strap in more spots now. It's less of an extreme concave shape, and it's touching in more spots. It's also much easier to go back and forth with. It's getting softer.
Why did you want to do this, the last step?
Because this is what it needs after that. I think we're gonna call that a day. And tonight, I wanna put it back in the freezer. And I'll tell you why in a moment. Because the freezer will help increase the humidity a little bit actually, and slow down, if there's still moisture in it, it'll slow down that drying process. The edges are on the inside. I'm less worried about the edges drying out. This is more for just the humidity getting in. But I think at this stage it's pretty negligible whether it was edges in or edges out. We need a towel for the baby. We've been working on the hide for 5 days now, and this morning I thought we might get to smoking today, but we're not gonna get there. I would say we're probably maybe 2 days away from being ready to patch the holes and start smoking it. It still actually has a little bit of moisture in it, and that's so what Helen and I were talking about all week is kind of like, is it ready? That's one of the things is like, does it feel dry enough yet? When I'm working by myself, I can unlace and relace the hide very quickly. So I'm not afraid of taking it from the frame, working it a certain way for half an hour, and then lacing it back up real fast. When we're at the wellness center and there's a lot of people learning how to still lace, it took about 3 times as long to lace up and unlace the hide. So we missed some windows where we could have been doing, it's the same techniques we were doing, we should have just done them alternating more often. And what I was afraid of when we were doing the big group work is that I'd rather have it on the frame and get a little bit too hard, because we can do what we're doing now and still soften and smooth and it's flat. If we would have taken it off the frame and we weren't stretching it correctly, then it'd get really hard, wrinkly spots that we would have had to have rebrained. And so I felt good because this is the way that Helen does it. It was the right choice to do for this situation we were in. And it just reiterates there are so many different ways to do it. And it's just like, what does the hide want to do in that moment? We'll keep scraping with the stones and keep cabling some more. And I'll do some back and forth on that steel beam thing. So some of those spots to work those out a little bit more. I'm used to working in one location, and that makes it a little bit easier to know when the hide is ready to be changed because there's less distractions and there's less things affecting the hide, and you get familiar with what's going to be affecting the hide, whether it's a fan, whether it's a heat source, whether it's a sunlight source, whatever it is. So those things kind of are why it took a little bit longer to do the hide this week. It also depends on how thick the hide is, and usually when I'm doing hide work, I start with a dry hide, rehydrate it, and then soak it in brains. And this time we started with a hide that had never been dried. So it took longer for me, it took longer to dry out than I thought it would, because it never lost that initial water. After we had scraped the hide outside the wellness center, I went back home and I pressure washed it, and I scraped it a few more times with Helen and myself. After we wash it and it's clean and it looks like there's no blood in it, it doesn't smell anymore, that's when you go around and cut the holes and lace it up on a frame and let it dry. And then it's shelf stable. It's rawhide, it's like a drum head. And then rehydrate it, put it in brains. That's my preferred method. And we didn't do that because Helen's preferred method is to scrape the hide, wash it, get it super clean, do the brains, start with softening. And I wanted to show the way that Helen does the process as much as possible. I don't usually have a time blocked out to spend like 3 weeks just doing hides. So I like to have stopping points in it, built into it. The other reason I like to lace it up and let it dry is that you get one initial stretch and it won't ever pull as hard again, and it won't ever absorb as much water again. So subsequently the hide is lighter because it's not absorbing as much water, and it dries out faster. Once you've rehydrated it, put it in the brain solution, it will dry out a little bit faster. So there are some spots in the hide that look like they're stained, and that's blood. What it looks like is blood coming out to the top. And that's one of the reasons why I like to dry out the hide once first, is that if there is blood that works its way up to the surface as that initial first dry and raw hide, you can soak it and get some of that blood to still come out after, possibly. And it's an indicator like, oh, that spot's gonna be really hard, because you can see it on that first dry. Or you can see a spot that was still fatty, because when it dries, it'll get really clear where there's fat still attached. And you can go back in and scrape that off before you put it in the braid solution as a dry stage. So that's one of the reasons why I like to work that way, because I don't have a river just to go put the hide and let it wash away, where Helen grew up on a river, and you could put the hide in the water. I used to have a hide washing machine, and it's dead right now, and I haven't got a new one to replace it. And I had to worry less about the blood when I had a washing machine, could just wash it and wash it and wash it. So that's part of what's happening on this one, and why some of the spots are really crunchy is they just may not have gotten clean enough. I use a washing machine to wash my fish skins and my moose hides, and it's just for hides. And I make sure it doesn't go on spin cycle, because the hide is so heavy wet that washing machines aren't rated for like 75 pounds of clothes in them, and the hide with water and all that can be very heavy. And so I make sure that I'm just using it on a rinse or wash cycle, and it doesn't spin, and then it'll just drain out. And you have to put it in a top loader. I've never tried a front loading washer, because they're not rated for that much weight, and it'd kill it pretty fast. So there's the question of, when do you choose to stop stretching, stop softening, and the hide is ready to smoke? And the hide should not be cool at all. And our hide today still it feels a little bit cool in spots. It still has water in it. And that's a big reason to not. It's the touch of, does this feel cool? Has it been at room temperature for a couple of hours and it's not getting crunchy? Those are some of the indicators. So you can see right here, there's some patches that are dark and they look kind of scaly. And I don't feel like that was like that last night. So this dried out a little, there was a little bit more moisture in there, and it did dry out. So that could be scraped again more. If you see spots that look scaly, that's definitely too hard. That's not a good thing. So this needs to be addressed a little bit before. So that's part of spending the time before you're gonna smoke, to really look over the hide on both sides thoroughly, and feel and touch and make sure that this still has a little bit of water in here. Let's take it back to the steel and break it and soften it a little bit more. Even though different parts of the hide, like 3/4 of the hide all felt good. And quick, oh yeah, this is done. But then I could visually see nope, that spot needs a little bit more time. Well, you're sitting on your front porch with your gun, the moose walks by and you shoot it right in front of the garage. That's the ideal scenario. And then you skin it with no holes in it. So you're starting with a hide that has no nicks and no holes in it. And then aging it, so you'd want to have it to where you can have it someplace warm for the skin to age for a couple of weeks so that the hair comes off really easily. You want to have water access to where you can wash off the hide like in a river or a creek, and weighted down with stones. And being able to have one location set up to where you can scrape the hide and have fresh water close by, whether it's a garden hose or the ocean or a river, to be able to scrape the hide on both sides, that flushing process. Having all of that in a close proximity is very helpful. And then having a area that's out of sunlight that you can stretch the hide to dry, if you're gonna go the raw hide drying it out route, and having that be in a stable spot. And then the same thing when you're working on with getting ready to tan with the brains, you want to have a place that's cool. I don't like working in rooms that are above 70. 65 to 60 is an ideal temperature because things don't dry out as fast. I don't like areas that have too much ventilation. Like if you have a fan blowing or air moving, that's not helpful. So it's kind of still-ish air, and not too humid and not too dry. You want 65% humidity is a good 65 to 75 is decent. And then 65 degrees. And having all your outdoor location close to where you're going to be scraping the indoor stuff. So having 2 posts that are firmly inset into a building or the ground, to where you can use as attachment points for doing the ringing and for having a cable going across, is really helpful. And having that being close proximity to where you have your frame being stretched. I like working on hides in the springtime and in the fall, late fall, early spring, when it still kind of can freeze at night possibly. That's my favorite times of year to work on hide. I can do it in winter, but the hard part is when you're doing all those water washing cycles, you're getting covered in water, and then when it's freezing, then you're covered in ice. You really can't work on a hide outside in weather that's about 20 degrees or colder, because the hide is just frozen, and then you start putting holes in it. And ideally not working below like 30 degrees for scraping is the ideal thing, because the hide just doesn't stretch like it needs to. But it's nice having it cool. So if you can acquire a hide and then have it age into fall to where it has the heat to get the bacteria to grow, to release the hair, and then when you're going to do all the washing cycles, it's cool. There's not as many bugs out, which is helpful as well. And then the hide dries slower when it's cold. So that's why I like those 2 times of year the best. So when working with just a close group of people, or myself and someone I'm quick with, I would stretch out the hide and do that same like squeegeeing action where it's vertical, where you're squeegeeing the water out. And then I would do that for a few hours, really working the water out. And then I'd flip it down, and then I would put towels out, or just have on my Carhartts, they're thick pants that can absorb a lot of water. And I'd move around pretty quickly, just working in the middle to the edges, middle to the edges, middle to the edges, and just going around in kind of concentric spots. And then I'd work a corner and go to the other side and work that, re-string it up, tighten those laces more. And that would be like the first 12 hours of work time. Then I might take it off the frame and bring it over like the back of a chair, which we ended up making out of wood, our framed piece that has the wooden and the steel. I would do that to the whole entire thing, and then roll it up, put it in the freezer in a plastic bag, or in the towel in a plastic bag, or just in a towel, put it in the freezer. The next day, I would warm it up by working it over the wooden or the steel piece again, just that friction vibrating. Since I don't have everyone's hands being body heat doing this, I have to get it to happen faster. So those big sweeping strokes across something that's 3 feet long replace everyone's body heat. And then I'd relace it up, and then I would start to do more of the spreading tools in the stone or the steel, working those. And then I might do that for like 2 hours, take it off the laces, go back and go along the steel arc piece, stretch it, put it back on the frame, tighten it, get more of the slack out, work, spread more, absorb more of that water, and then I might do that for a couple hours and then switch and do some of the hand twisting work, and then go to the cable and start doing the cable. And the place to start doing the cable is when your edges will be dry enough and your middle is dry enough to start gliding and not getting gummed up. So it shouldn't look clear anymore. So that's the part to start introducing the cable. And the cable, or even cable or rope or the ratchet strap, because you can go so quickly, the friction from that dries out the hide faster. So if you're not cabling, it might take you an extra half day to dry. So going from 2 12-hour days, it might be 2.5 days, because it's going to take longer to dry.